In his view, the twitches of severed heads were nothing more than mechanical muscle movements without any trace of consciousness. Countless well-documented cases describe animals, chickens, cockroaches, frogs, snakes, even praying mantises, continuing to survive for surprising lengths of time after being decapitated. For instance, rattlesnakes are notorious. Even after beheading, their heads have been filmed striking and biting with deadly precision. Since the guillotine remained in use in France until 1977, scientists eventually carried out studies using advanced techniques on freshly severed human heads. Reports often mention brief eye or mouth movements, but modern experts insist these are only reflexive spasms that linger for a moment after death. Yet despite this consensus, unsettling doubts and contradictory accounts still persist. One of the most infamous stories emerged in 1905. In Orleans, France, a man named Henry Langy was executed by guillotine. Dr. Gabriel Borio, who witnessed it, later claimed the head twitched, and when he called out Langy's name, the lifeless eyes rolled upward and locked directly onto him. He swore this eerie gaze lasted up to 30 seconds. However, years later in 1939, the Journal of the American Medical Association suggested Borio had exaggerated. Other witnesses insisted life flickered for no more than 10 seconds, and the reactions were far less dramatic. Modern science maintains that once the blade falls, both body and head succumb quickly. Death results from shock, massive blood loss, plummeting blood pressure, and anoxia, the complete lack of oxygen. The heart may beat for up to a minute, but the head itself retains only enough oxygen to keep metabolism alive for around 7 seconds. Technically, the brain could function for perhaps 2 to 3 seconds, but any activity would exist in a fixed, unresponsive state, devoid of true awareness. Still, the debate has never been put fully to rest. Could a spark of consciousness remain in those fleeting moments after the blade? The question continues to haunt scientists and historians alike. Moving from the guillotine to other grim practices, one of the most chilling execution methods in history was the gibbet. This instrument, used for public punishment, can be traced back to antiquity. Known as gibbeting or hanging in chains, it meant leaving a body on display after execution, sometimes even placing the victim alive in the cage to die slowly. References to this method even appear in the Old Testament. Gibbets varied in design depending on region and era, usually forged by blacksmiths at great expense. Essentially a type of gallows, the gibbet had a projecting arm from which a criminal's body would hang. Unlike ordinary hangings, the body was chained in place and left until it decomposed completely. Clothes decayed, flesh withered, and the remains became a grotesque public warning. Some were enclosed in iron cages to preserve the spectacle longer. These grim displays were often set along major roads or high places, sometimes raised 20 or 30 feet in the air to ensure visibility for miles around. In certain cases, the bodies remained hanging for decades. Gibbeting was usually reserved for men, traders, pirates, highwaymen, murderers, and even sheep stealers, its primary goal being deterrence through humiliation and fear. A famous case was that of John Hutchins, a London solicitor executed in 1684 for murdering a waterman named John Sparks. Hutchins had fallen into a life of debauchery, spending nights in alehouses and with prostitutes. One drunken evening, he quarreled with Sparks and, in a violent rage, stabbed him fatally. Although Hutchins admitted to his debauched lifestyle, he never confessed to the killing. For refusing to admit guilt, he was sentenced to the disgrace of the gibbet. On December 17, 1684, Hutchins was hanged and left suspended, though his body was cut down less than an hour later and buried in unhallowed ground. Pirates also suffered this fate. Near rivers or the sea, their corpses were left dangling until the tides had submerged them 3 times. In London, Execution Dock on the River Thames was infamous for such spectacles. Particularly notorious criminals sometimes had their bodies tarred and displayed in iron cages further downstream at Cuckold's Point or Blackwell Point on the Greenwich Peninsula, ensuring they were remembered long after death. Such was the grim fate of Captain William Kidd in May 1701. His body was left to rot for 3 long years, dangling as a shocking reminder to pirates of what awaited them if caught. Before the 18th century, Gibbeting was used only occasionally. But in 1752, the Murder Act, formally titled an Act for Better Preventing the Horrid Crime of Murder, changed everything. This law made post-mortem punishments common. Murderers were no longer given a burial. Instead, they were dissected or hung in chains for the public to see. It was meant not only as justice, but as vengeance. The law itself was influenced by the notorious Hawkist gang. During the 1740s, these smugglers terrorized southeastern England, running contraband tea and alcohol while committing robbery and brutal killings. One of their most infamous crimes was the savage murder of Richard Hawkins, a farm laborer accused of stealing their tea. Hawkins was tortured, beaten, kicked, and whipped to death before his body was sunk beneath a lake, weighed down with stones. For 9 months, his corpse lay hidden before being discovered. When the gang was finally broken, 75 members were imprisoned or executed, with 14 gibbeted for the sheer cruelty of their acts. The last known use of the gibbet in Britain took place in 1832, nearly a century after the Murder Act. 2 men, William Jobling in Jarrow and James Cook in Leicester, were displayed on the dreadful frames. By 1834, however, the practice was outlawed for being barbaric. Still, remnants remain. 16 gibbets can still be found across England, and one of them even holds the skull of its unfortunate occupant. The breaking wheel. Among medieval torture devices, few were feared as much as the breaking wheel, also called the Catherine wheel. Originating in ancient Greece, it evolved into both an execution and torture device, remaining in use until the 19th century. During the Middle Ages, it became a gruesome alternative to being drawn and quartered. The wheel itself was a massive wooden wagon wheel, sometimes studded with iron spikes. In one notorious description from 1518, the condemned man's arms were laid on timbers, while the executioner shattered them with the wheel itself. His legs and back were then broken in the same fashion before the mangled body was hoisted upright atop a tall beam. Struggling to breathe, the victim would be left to suffer for hours, or even longer. Shockingly, one account tells of a man who endured the agony for 9 full days before dying. Spectators gathered to witness these public tortures. The longer the victim lived, the greater the crowd's excitement. Occasionally, the torment ended with a quick throat cut, but often the goal was suffering. In a variation resembling crucifixion, the victim's body was bent into an X shape on the wheel, his bones smashed with iron rods until his limbs were threaded through the spokes. One chilling broadside from Hamburg in 1607 described the victim as a screaming puppet writhing in streams of blood, a sea monster of broken flesh and splintered bones. The wheel's cruelty knew no limits. Sometimes victims were strapped to it and rolled down hills, or swung over blazing fires until both wood and flesh caught flame. The device later became tied to the legend of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. According to medieval writings, she was sentenced to the wheel for refusing to renounce her Christian faith. Yet when she touched it, the wheel shattered miraculously. She was beheaded instead, and though historians doubt her existence, she became one of the most beloved saints of the Middle Ages. Joan of Arc herself claimed to have heard Catherine's voice. The wheel lingered into modern times, with the last recorded use in Prussia in 1841. By then, shifting ideas of justice and human rights finally ended such tortures. Still, in the Middle Ages, the breaking wheel was every criminal's nightmare, an execution designed to terrify even the bravest. The rack. Another infamous medieval device was the rack. Its origins are debated, but stories claim it was used as far back as ancient Greece to torture slaves and non-citizens. The historian Herostratus, who set fire to the Temple of Artemis in 356 BC, was allegedly stretched on the rack to confess. Alexander the Great, too, was said to have used it in 328 BC against conspirators, even his own court historian Callisthenes. Yet many doubt these tales, noting little proof from Greece or Rome. What is certain is that by the Middle Ages, the rack became firmly established across Europe, particularly in Anglo-Saxon England. The device was a large wooden frame, either flat or set upright. Rollers connected to levers or wheels would pull the victim's arms and legs apart, stretching joints until they tore apart or dislocated. The sound of snapping cartilage and cracking bones filled the air as the victim screamed in agony. One of the most gruesome aspects of the rack was the horrifying sound it produced. Loud pops as cartilage, ligaments, and bones snapped under pressure. In some countries, modifications made the torture even worse. In France, for instance, spikes were added to the wooden planks beneath the victim, piercing their back as they were stretched. While confined on the rack, victims were often subjected to additional horrors, burning, or even having their fingernails and toenails ripped away. The rack's main purpose was to force answers from prisoners. Its use grew dramatically during the Middle Ages, particularly at the height of the Inquisition. The Catholic Church held immense power across Europe, and it was Pope Lucius III who first dispatched inquisitors to hunt down heretics. By the late 12th century, entire groups like the Cathars in southern France faced brutal persecution. Later, in the Kingdom of Aragon, inquisitors formally employed the rack to extract confessions of heresy. As the infamous Spanish Inquisition began in 1478, torture became routine practice. Unlike earlier inquisitors, who answered to the Pope, the Spanish Inquisition fell directly under the control of monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. England, too, adopted the rack between the 15th and 17th centuries. It was reportedly introduced by John Holland, the Duke of Exeter and Constable of the Tower. Under the Tudor and Stuart monarchies, torture, including the rack, was frequently justified in treason trials. Among the monarchs who approved its use were Mary I, better known as Bloody Mary, Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I. The Tower of London became infamous as the center of such punishments, where the rack earned the nickname, the Duke of Exeter's daughter. One notable victim was Askew, the only woman known to have been racked in the Tower. A follower of Martin Luther's Protestant teachings, she was arrested in 1546 for spreading reformist beliefs, and was tortured so severely she could no longer walk. Yet she never abandoned her faith. Ultimately, she was executed, burned at the stake for her convictions. Perhaps the most famous case tied to the rack was Guy Fawkes after the failed gunpowder plot of 1605. Lesser tortures failed to break him, so he was eventually stretched on the rack multiple times. The suffering was so severe that he fainted before signing his confession. When revived, his trembling signature condemned him. Sentenced to death, Fawkes was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, one of the most agonizing executions of the age. Yet when led to the noose, he threw himself with enough force to snap his neck, ending his torment early. Even then, his body was still drawn and quartered. A version of the rack endured in Russia until the 18th century. Over time, however, most countries abandoned it in favor of punishments considered less barbaric. Still, its reputation as one of history's most terrifying devices lingers. The thumb screws. Medieval torture was as creative as it was brutal, and one of its most infamous devices was the thumb screw. Torture in court trials became increasingly common after the sweeping legal reforms of the 12th and 13th centuries. Before these changes, citizenship often protected individuals from torture. Only in rare cases, such as high treason or clear evidence of guilt, would a citizen be stripped of such protections. But slaves, prisoners of war, and foreign visitors had no such shield. The turning point came when Italian lawmakers revived and applied Roman legal doctrines. These reforms spread across Europe, creating a near-universal code. Roman law demanded unusually high proof, either 2 reliable eyewitnesses or a full confession. Without this, even guilty individuals might go free. Judges, eager to secure convictions, increasingly authorized torture when guilt seemed probable. This escalation gave rise to the thumbscrews, also called thumbkins. The device was simple but vicious. It consisted of 3 metal poles, one or more threaded, standing vertically on a vise-like frame. A horizontal plate of wood or metal slid up and down the poles. The victim's fingers, or often both thumbs, were placed beneath the plate. Screws were then twisted down, forcing the plate to crush bone by bone. In some versions, spikes were added to pierce nails and flesh as the screws tightened. The trauma caused severe swelling in the arms and unbearable agony. If the tormentor wished to be especially cruel, the same treatment was inflicted on the victim's big toes. Thumb screws became notorious because they rarely killed outright. Instead, they delivered excruciating pain, finger by finger, joint by joint, leaving the victim shattered but alive. Thumbscrews became a favored weapon of choice for Spanish inquisitors during the infamous Spanish Inquisition, which began in the 15th century and did not officially end until the early 19th. Torture in this period was routine, designed to force heretics into confessing their sins. Victims endured starvation, burning, the rack, and, of course, the dreaded thumbscrews. Often, the device was used alongside other tortures to multiply the agony. Some prisoners confessed and were granted penance and forgiveness if they renounced their heresies and embraced Catholic doctrine. Others were not so fortunate. Many who refused to abandon their beliefs were condemned to the flames, burned alive at the stake. Among the most famous names linked to inquisitorial trials was Galileo Galilei. The great astronomer was interrogated in 1633 during the Roman Inquisition. Threatened with torture, possibly the thumbscrews, Galileo reluctantly admitted his heresy, supporting heliocentrism, the radical Copernican theory that the Earth revolved around the sun. Though spared actual torture, Galileo spent the remainder of his life under house arrest, his brilliance silenced by fear. During the late medieval and early modern periods, thumbscrews were also a favorite weapon in witch trials. Interrogators often began with them, knowing their effectiveness at forcing confessions. But as panic over witchcraft spread, doubts arose. Were these confessions genuine, or simply the desperate cries of victims broken by unbearable pain? In Scotland, strict laws required a legal warrant from the Privy Council before torture could be used. Yet such warrants only fueled witch hunts that consumed the country in the late 16th century. The thumbscrews became so infamous that Sir Walter Scott, the celebrated author of Ivanhoe, reportedly kept a pair in his collection. In later years, skepticism grew. In England, Germany, and elsewhere, the use of thumbscrews in witch trials declined, as many began questioning the reliability of such confessions. Still, the device did not disappear. Even into the 18th century, thumbscrews were used as punishment aboard slave ships, crushing the digits of those who resisted. In the Russian army, disobedient soldiers also felt their cruel bite. A device so small, yet capable of inflicting endless torment, thumbscrews became a symbol of how far fear and power could twist the pursuit of justice.